if you ignored the puddle of green acid currently eating through the high tensile alloy floor. You'd think it was just another quiet Tuesday in the neutral hub's atrium. A smuggled, out-of-control, HFY devourer was tearing into the central load-bearing pillar. The alarms were screaming so loud I thought my cranial antennae were going to rupture. Yet right in the middle of this absolute chaos, the kind that would send any high-tier Star Knight into a panic, a human in dark blue coveralls was carrying a yellow plastic bucket, looking annoyed as hell and bitching about having to work overtime. My advanced olfactory organs could clearly pick up the lethal toxic gas spewing from the devourer, but I couldn't scent a single trace of fear pheromones coming from this human named David. He dunked a long stick with a bunch of ragged cloth tied to the end into his bucket. It was filled with a chemical slurry he brought from Earth, something he called Janitor's Special. He took that heavy metal mop, soaked rags and all, and shoved it straight down the devourer's gaping, predatory maw. That throat was overflowing with green acid saliva, strong enough to melt through 3 inches of titanium. The second the sodium hypochlorite hit that acid, the very air popped and sizzled with a violent explosive hiss. Hiding behind a pillar 20 yards away, my sensitive olfactory glands were instantly seared numb by the pungent stench clawing its way into my system. Massive plumes of bright yellow-green toxic gas billowed out from the beast's throat, spraying through its jagged teeth and flooding the entire atrium. Even the cold, white fluorescent lights overhead were choked by a hazy yellow smog. The devourer's roar, which had just been shaking the whole damn hall, caught dead in its throat. Its massive 3-ton body violently arched like a drawn bow. Its barbed claws tore frantically at its own neck, and black bloody foam started oozing from the roots of its alloy shredding, blade-like teeth. I clamped my hands desperately over my respiratory spiracles, shrinking deeper into the pillar's shadow. The sensory antennae on my head were shivering uncontrollably from the hyper-concentrated toxins. I didn't even dare move when my tactical recorder slipped half a meter from my feet. My eyes were locked onto the out-of-control monster. I watched the chemical slurry hit its chitinous armor. Along the edges of its pale gray shell, a dense layer of blisters began to form. Within seconds, those tiny blisters swelled. They ruptured, oozing a viscous yellow-green sludge. The hardened shell carbonized and turned pitch black right before my eyes, flaking off in chunks from its massive bulk. The acrid gas rode the ventilation draft straight toward me. My already burned olfactory organs felt like they'd been stuffed with red-hot gravel. My sensory antennae went completely dead. I scrambled back, crawling deeper behind the pillar, my knuckles popping as I gripped my tactical recorder. Unbidden, my memory flashed back to 3 days ago. I was escorting a high envoy here to sign a neutrality pact. That arrogant prick had deliberately stomped his boots, caked in concentrated star honey, right onto the pristine off-white tiles David had just polished, grinding in 6 distinct black marks. Then he tossed his empty sugar tin onto the freshly wiped reception desk. Out of boredom, I had scanned David's vitals. For 3 solid minutes, this lowly human janitor's heart rate stayed as steady as the station's main reactor. Not a single fluctuation. At the time, I sneered, thinking the servants of lower-tier civilizations were just spineless cowards. I stole a glance at David standing by the airlock. He had that half-empty bucket of chemical slurry sitting at his feet. The mop was resting casually against his shoulder. He was just squinting at the violently thrashing devourer, and his shoulders didn't even flinch. Right then, a heavy hum of plasma locks charging up echoed from the sealed main airlock beside me. The crisp, metallic clack of the door engaging struck every nerve in my body. Zeryl's tactical visor picked up the hum of the airlock latches charging through the metallic bulkhead. Green unlock prompts flooded his holographic display. As the captain of the interstellar security forces, he had been holding position outside with 3 heavily armed operatives for over half an hour. Their orders: execute the rogue HFY devourer that breached the hub. No capture required. Their bright cyan chitin armor shimmered with the pale blue halo of biological shielding. All 4 operatives had their plasma rifles fully charged, the superheated air around the muzzles distorting into violent ripples. The moment the main airlock slid open, a pungent, violently spicy, and utterly alien stench hit them on the ventilation draft. Zeral's sensitive chemoreceptors twitched, but the pride of a high-tier knight made him brush the anomaly off. It was probably just some human janitor knocking over the wrong chemicals. The 4-man squad breached the atrium in standard tactical formation. They immediately locked onto the behemoth in the center. Massive sections of the Devourer's chitinous armor were charred black and carbonized. Thick, viscous drool mixed with liquefied tissue dripped from its armor plating. A deep, wet gurgle rolled from its throat as it slowly turned its massive head toward the intruders. Focus fire on the center mass. Standard purge protocol, Zaral commanded in a rigid, synthetic tone. All 4 pulled their triggers simultaneously. 4 blinding blue-white bolts of searing plasma smashed into the beast. Zaral was fully expecting to see the armor shatter and its organs melt to slag. But the expected explosion never came. Every single plasma bolt deflected off the rugged carbonized armor, ricocheting straight into the decorative stone wall behind it. The blasts carved out 4 glowing, slag-filled craters, showering the hall with scalding shrapnel and shattered glass. Zeral's tactical HUD instantly flashed blood red. The AI alarm started screaming, "Unknown corrosion has altered armor curvature. Total plasma deflection. Core defenses impenetrable." He forcefully tensed his exoskeleton. Just as he was about to bark an order to adjust vectors and target the soft tissue of the throat, the metal floor beneath his boots began to violently tremble. The Devourer, its throat eaten away by acid, went absolutely berserk. Shedding chunks of carbonized chitin with every step, its massive bulk smashed right through the smokescreen of the plasma fire. The 2 pointmen didn't even have time to recalibrate their aim. A massive tail, as thick as the station's bulkheads, swept in with enough wind pressure to rip the air apart. Their biological shields barely deployed halfway before their reinforced chitin chest plates shattered like cheap glass. The 2 operatives were swatted away like broken clay pigeons, slamming brutally into the atrium's white marble columns. Blue-green blood frothed and poured down the grooves of the stone, pooling into a massive slick on the polished metal floor. They lay there convulsing, unable to even transmit a coherent distress signal. Zeral's pupils pinned. Without a second thought, he cranked his full-coverage tactical energy shield to maximum output. The translucent blue barrier securely shielded the lone standing operative and his 2 critically wounded subordinates behind him. The low-frequency hum of his plasma rifle charging made his palms numb. The searing white muzzle stayed locked dead on the charging beast. The moment his shield collided with the Devourer's plunging shoulder plate, the massive shockwave sent Zaral's boots skidding backward. His shield energy plummeted by nearly 30% instantly. He gritted his mandibles to stabilize his stance, preparing to call in the reserves. But out of the corner of his eye, he caught movement. Over by the janitorial cart on the side wall, that human cleaner in the dark blue coveralls, the one who had been watching this whole shit show with cold indifference, was reaching down into the bottom compartment of his cart. David's knuckles brushed the plastic latch of the cart's bottom bin. With a quick flick of his fingers, he popped it open and yanked it out. He took one look at the absolute mess of a room. His jaw tightened, and he muttered, "Son of a bitch." The decorative planters were completely pulverized, slathering half the wall in wet mud. Plasma scorch marks pitted the polished marble floor. Half of the crystal chandelier hanging from the dome had collapsed, scattering shattered glass and molting Devourer chitin all over the damn place. He was 40 minutes away from locking up his closet, grabbing a cold beer at the Hub Port Bar, and watching the league broadcast with the bartender. Now? Cleaning up this disaster zone was going to take at least 2 hours. His overtime request had just been denied by station management last week. They had the gall to say, "Public area maintenance falls under your primary duties." He wasn't seeing a single dime of overtime for this. He kicked away a bloody chunk of chitin at his feet. His heavy boots crushed it with a sickening crunch. His eyes swept over Zeryl's squad standing rigidly behind their energy shield, then over to Prial cowering behind cover. The low hum of the shield drifted over the 15-yard gap, mixing with the Devourer's ragged, wheezing gasps. The noise made David's temples throb. His gaze finally settled on the massive beast, which was currently blowing blood bubbles out of its neck and glaring right at him. He let out a thoroughly pissed-off grunt. Sitting in the bin was a gallon jug of industrial-grade ammonia cleaner. The discount sticker from the station mart was still slapped on the side. The ink was half smudged, but you could still read special $8. David grabbed the cold plastic jug, his wrist flexing as he yanked the heavy bottle out. The yellow plastic bucket, still holding the bleach slurry, sat right by his feet. A faint whiff of lingering disinfectant drifted from the rim. He weighed the jug in his hand, his thumb slipping naturally over the safety seal on the cap. I was hiding behind the backing of the collapsed reception desk. My sensory antennae were already fried into stiff plastic by the leaked chlorine gas. Half of my olfactory tract was constantly leaking clear fluid. The hand holding my tactical recorder was shaking so badly, I could barely keep the screen steady. But I couldn't tear my eyes away from that human in the dark blue coveralls. His thumb pressed down on the ammonia's safety seal, his knuckles turning white from the pressure. The next second, with practiced, almost ridiculous fluidity, he pulled a crumpled, cheap earth-made half-mask respirator from his belt. He slapped it over his face. His calloused fingers yanked the straps tight. He didn't look like a soldier preparing to deploy a weapon. He just looked like a guy getting ready to scrub a floor soaked in battery acid. Snap. The safety ring popped off, clinking and rolling far across the smooth marble floor. He twisted the cap off with one hand. A sharply pungent alkaline odor immediately caught the draft. My already chemically burned sensory membranes violently contracted, like red-hot nails being driven straight into my sinuses. I choked so hard I nearly snapped my antennae off. I quickly ducked lower, peeking through a gap in the backing board. He hoisted that gallon jug of ammonia, angling the nozzle right over the dirty yellow bucket at his feet. The mop was still sitting in there, steeping in half a bucket of sodium hypochlorite slurry. The clear liquid splashed down, draining fast. A dozen paces away, the Devourer was still wheezing bloody air, dropping chunks of armor everywhere. Zeryl's security squad was busy cowering behind their shield, trying to patch up their wounded. Nobody was paying an ounce of attention to the lowly janitor. The last drop of ammonia splashed into the bucket. With a flick of his wrist, David chucked the empty jug aside. It clattered right into a plasma-melted crater in the bulkhead. I cowered behind the charred reception desk. The sensory lining in my cranial cavity was already bleeding from the escaped chlorine. But the exact moment those two clear liquids mixed, a searing agony 10 times worse than before, spiked straight into my chemoreceptors. The pain was so intense my half-paralyzed antennae curled into tight knots. My knuckles spasmed around the tactical recorder. A vicious, bubbling boil instantly erupted from the yellow bucket. Pale yellow-green clouds of toxic vapor billowed furiously over the rim. Corrosive microparticles rode the station's weak air currents right at me. Even hiding behind cover, even wearing a level 3 filtration mask, the fumes burned my trachea like wildfire. A deadly neurocorrosive cocktail, completely undocumented in the Interstellar Security Force's biowarfare database. And it had just been brewed by a human janitor in blue coveralls, using 2 bottles of bargain bin cleaning supplies. The heavily wounded Devourer was still thrashing its tail and roaring in place, its shedding armor clattering loudly against the deck. Its ruined respiratory tract was huffing black blood. It had absolutely no idea what was coming. I peered through the crack in the backing. Half of David's face was hidden behind that cheap respirator. I couldn't see his expression. All I saw was his calloused hands gripping that mop handle in a death grip. His knuckles were white. He dropped his hips, yanked his right shoulder back, a perfect wind-up. Just like the Earth baseball player's IED seen swinging in the hub's entertainment sector. The heavy metal mop handle cut through the air with a dull whoomp, smashing solid into the bottom of the bucket. The entire yellow plastic bucket, overflowing with hyper-concentrated toxic vapor, launched through the air. Trailing a churning tail of yellow smoke, it flew straight toward the devourer's gaping throat. Zaral leaned against his humming, vibrating tactical shield. The safety on his plasma rifle was off. His 2 critically wounded operatives were slumped against the bulkhead, coughing up bloody froth, laced with armor shrapnel. Through the tracking frame of his tactical HUD, Zaral locked onto that flying yellow bucket, trailing chemical smoke. It was just a projectile thrown by a lowly human cleaner. He had initially written it off as the desperate, futile flailing of cornered prey. The yellow bucket scored a dead center hit right into the devourer's ulcerated, open maw. The plastic shell exploded on impact. A half-bucket payload of hyper-concentrated chloramine gas and chemical slurry instantly flooded the monster's respiratory tract. Even the exposed chitin around its face immediately bubbled and carbonized, sloughing off in massive sheets. The devourer, which had just been thrashing and roaring in a violent frenzy, completely froze. Its gigantic body went slack, as if every bone had just been ripped out of it. Its claws clawed uselessly at its own throat. Black-green toxic blood poured out of its armor seams like a waterfall. On the tactical HUD, the monster's bioelectric signatures took an absolute nosedive. Its respiratory filtration system suffered total catastrophic failure within a single second of exposure. The beast shut down before its biological shields even had time to trigger. The hulking mass swayed twice before collapsing. The sheer deck-rattling weight of it brought it crashing down, obliterating the very last intact observation window in the atrium. Glass shrapnel and black monster blood sprayed everywhere. Zaral's tactical AI instantly blew up with red alerts. Warning: unknown toxic molecular concentration has breached class of biological weapon thresholds. He stared at the monster lying dead in the glass. Just minutes ago, it had face-tanked a concentrated plasma barrage from his entire squad. Then he looked up at the human janitor, standing in a puddle of dirty water. Beneath his helmet, Zaral stopped breathing. I slumped against a broken decorative pillar. The pale blue blood beading on my sensory antennae smeared stickily against the freezing bulkhead. Every breath felt like inhaling red-hot sand directly into my chemoreceptors. Waves of sharp agony washed over me, blurring my vision. The behemoth's convulsions had long ceased. The Hexmaw devourer, the nightmare that shrugged off 4 plasma rifles and chewed through tactical energy shields, was just laying there in a pile of broken glass. Its chitin armor was still sizzling with yellow-green acid smoke. Its bioelectric field was as cold as a dead deep space asteroid. With a loud mechanical hum, the atrium's HVAC system auto-kicked into overdrive. The massive exhaust fans sucked the lingering toxic fumes into the vents. The harsh sting ripped through my scorched mucous membranes, forcing me to curl up and violently cough. Blood dripped faster from my damaged antennae. I looked up. The human cleaner in the blue coveralls was standing in ankle-deep dirty water. He casually pulled off his cheap, crumpled half-mask and clipped it back onto his belt. Reaching into his pocket, he pulled out a filthy, detergent-stained rag. He completely bypassed the shattered glass, strolled lazily over to a control console, and started wiping off the monster's slime splattered all over the panel. His movements were so mundane, you'd think he was just wiping up a half-spilled coffee from some interstellar aristocrat. He was grumbling something under his breath, his tone practically dripping with annoyed inconvenience. I clutched my stinging nose and turned to look at the security captain. Zoral still had his tactical energy shield cranked to 70% capacity. The integrated AI alarms in his visor were frying his neural link, making his cranium ache with the buzzing. Blinding red warning boxes flashed wildly in the dead center of his vision. The unknown chemical molecules in the air were flagged in glaring red, Class A prohibited weapon of mass biochemical destruction. Residual concentration exceeds safe limits by a factor of 720. Biohazard threat level, maximum. He looked down at the two operatives with shattered chest plates. Their exposed respiratory tendrils were convulsing uncontrollably. Pale blue blood wept from their mucosal wounds. They were already burned by the residual gas. Zoral snapped his head toward the only unharmed operative, barking at him to drag the wounded to the nearest quarantine airlock immediately. He ordered him to seal the environmental doors to cut off the toxic spread. The operative hauled the casualties up and staggered back. Zoral pressed his shield controls, unhesitatingly powering down the barrier. His chitinous mandibles clicked apart in pure, utter shock. For 3 whole seconds, his brain completely stalled. The Hex Maw Devourer was supposed to be able to tank a starship's main cannon. 4 heavily armed security operatives couldn't even dent its armor. And it had just been flatlined by a human janitor in dirty coveralls using 2 buckets of cheap liquid. Zoral tightened his grip on the rifle stock. He sucked in a deep breath of dry, filtered air. His index finger curled around the plasma rifle's trigger, and the crosshairs dropped dead center onto David's chest. He engaged his tactical loudspeaker. The icy, synthetic electronic voice echoed through the massive atrium. Every syllable adhered rigidly to protocol, unwavering and stiff. Human David. Acting as commander of the Interstellar Security Forces, I hereby charge you with violating Article 1, Section 3 of the Interstellar Geneva Conventions, illegal possession and deployment of a prohibited biochemical weapon of mass destruction. The crosshairs didn't waver. Zoral stared down the thoroughly unamused human cleaner and delivered the arrest warrant, word by synthetic word. Drop your mop and rags immediately. Place your hands on your head and lie face down on the deck. You are under arrest by the Interstellar Anti-Terror Tribunal. David stood right next to the massive devourer corpse, his dirty rag draped lazily over the mop handle. Hearing the charges, he actually raised an eyebrow. A crass, street-level smirk tugged at the corner of his mouth. The translator relayed his profanity with crystal clarity straight to Zoral. Fuck outta here. Y'all think I ain't worked enough overtime already? He didn't even pretend to surrender. He just casually reached over to wipe another glob of monster slime off the console. He gave absolutely zero shits about the plasma rifle pointed at his chest. Zoral's mandibles locked tight in fury. His trigger finger squeezed another half-inch. A faint blue glow began to hum inside the plasma barrel. The hiss of charging energy vibrated right into his bones. Just then, his HUD caught a tiny flicker of movement behind the ruined reception desk to his left, a twitching sensory antenna. I was still huddled behind the broken marble desk. The second my antenna twitched, a red targeting laser swept right over me. Piercing agony crawled through my poisoned system. Blue blood wept from the splits in my antennae, dripping onto the toxic tiles and sizzling into tiny acid bubbles. Gritting my teeth, I dragged myself against the freezing bulkhead. Half leaning on the rubble, I wildly waved my tactical recorder at Zoral. My chemical receptors were practically dead. Every breath of chloramine-laced air felt like swallowing a handful of hot glass. Blood kept weeping from my membranes, pattering onto the casing of the recorder strapped to my chest. Zoral, stand down. I ripped my vocal cords roaring at him, the air tearing painfully through my scorched sinuses. That devourer was an illegal biosmuggle. The Earthling killed it and saved the whole damn station. He didn't violate the convention. Zoral's exoskeleton was tense as forged steel. He didn't even turn his head. His full coverage visor stayed firmly locked on David, who was just standing by his cart. The plasma rifle's core began to whine, a shrill, escalating pitch. The pale blue halo of full charge bled from the barrel vents, casting a harsh, cold glow over the commander's chitinous jawline. Any undeclared weapon of mass biochemical destruction must be purged on sight by security forces. His voice was as dead as deep space. His finger tensed on the trigger. David didn't even bat an eye. He wasn't giving up. There was a huge glob of monster slime clinging to the shoulder of his blue coveralls. He casually tossed his detergent-stained rag over it, reached down to his belt, and clicked the transmit button on a beat-up, paint-chipped walkie-talkie. A gruff, gravelly drawl punched right through the comms channel, echoing deep into the subterranean maintenance tunnels. Maintenance, this is David in Atrium B. Got some trigger-happy jackass down here blocking us from doing our jobs. He let go of the mic. He propped the rag-tied metal mop against his leg. The hard heel of his steel toe-work boot knocked against the marble floor with a heavy thud. He glanced briefly at Prial, shivering and bleeding in the corner, before bringing his eyes back to Zaral. The look on his face, it was the exact same look you'd give a drunk who just puked on the carpet. You literally just steam cleaned. It was deep, bone-weary irritation. Not an ounce of fear. He was just completely over these armored dickheads, making him late to clock out. All this extra cleanup meant more overtime, and the goddamn station committee had been freezing his overtime pay for 3 months. He even lifted a hand to scratch his stubble and scoffed, "I clean up a man-eating pile of contraband trash for y'all? And not only are you deadbeats skipping out on the cleaning fee, you're trying to put a hole in me? That how interstellar security rolls?" The translator fed the insolence verbatim straight into Zaral's feed. The strobing red warnings on his HUD were blinding. His respiratory tendrils burned from the lingering gas. A chaotic mix of fury and reality-shattering panic seized his hand. His knuckles compressed, turning his exoskeleton a sickly pale color as he slowly hauled back the blistering trigger. The whole atrium fell dead silent, save for the whining pitch of the plasma rifle. David just tilted his head, waiting for him to pull it. Zaral's finger found the absolute bottom of the trigger pull. But 3 meters from his boots, a faint metallic groan echoed from a heavy maintenance hatch. The subtle crunch of misaligned bolts. 3 deafening cracks exploded at once. 360-pound heavy metal access panels, rusted bolts and all, were violently kicked straight out of their frames. They spun through the air, smashing into the reception desk and turning the already ruined crystal facade into fine dust. A heavy, choking wall of motor oil, diesel fumes, and cheap tobacco blasted out of the tunnels. Zaral's already damaged respiratory tendrils violently seized. Spikes of blinding pain shot through his nervous system. The plasma charge at his fingertips wavered. Instinctively, he swung his rifle toward the blown hatches. Emerging from the pitch-black shadows of the utility networks, massive, hulking human figures stood up, stepping one by one into the atrium's lights. Their bright yellow coveralls were smeared with grease, diesel, and rust. Every single one of them was holding heavy hardware. A man-sized hydraulic wrench, pressurized aerosol cans covered in Earth script. One guy even had a brand new, unopened jug of industrial cleaner tucked into his waistband. I recognized the hazmat symbols on the label. It was the exact same shit that had just melted the Devourer. The lead heavy stood at the front, his shoulders easily twice as wide as David's. A paper-wrapped cylinder of tobacco hung loosely from his lips. He casually blew out a thick cloud of blue-gray smoke. The moment that scent hit me, my sensitive chemical receptors practically detonated. Scorching pain drilled from my airways straight into my skull. I muffled a groan, clamping my jaw shut and holding my breath. Nicotine, a Class 3 lethal neurotoxin in the interstellar pharmacopoeia. And this human was just casually puffing it out into a sealed space station. Before I could even recover from the agony, the 6 men fanned out in a slick tactical spread. Their heavy boots hammered against the deck, effectively walling off the highly annoyed David behind them. David yanked the slime-soaked rag off his shoulder and casually wiped it onto the leader's back. He muttered some earth curse I couldn't translate, presumably still bitching about being kept on the clock. The big guy spat out his cigarette butt. His meaty palm clamped over the grip of the hydraulic wrench. He lowered the massive tool to his side, and all at once, every single human locked eyes with Zeral and the plasma rifle he had pointed at them. Zeral's tactical visor absolutely freaked out. Red warnings flooded his entire display. The AI's icy threat assessments bored into his pounding skull. Every single item in the human's hands was registering as a maximum threat weapon. Heavy kinetic armor, piercing weaponry, highly toxic unknown aerosols, Class A prohibited biochemical agents. The grease-covered foreman slammed his man-sized hydraulic wrench straight down onto the metal deck. The ringing crash bounced broken glass half an inch off the ground. He shot Zaral a dirty sideways glare, his voice like grinding steel plates. "You want to touch one of ours? Best ask the wrench first." Zaral's constricted breathing tendrils seized up entirely. Pale green fluid wept from the roots of his tendrils, leaking through the gaps of his chitin armor and dripping onto the floor. His peripheral vision swept behind him. Prial was cowering behind a pillar, his chemical sensory antennae convulsing non-stop. His 2 critically wounded operatives were bubbling green froth with every breath. And his last standing squadmate? The one with an intact shield? His fingers were shivering so hard he could barely hold his plasma rifle. He had just seen it with his own eyes. The Devourer, unfazed by concentrated plasma fire, died to a half bucket of dirty water mixed with 2 household cleaners. These humans were just holding their everyday work tools. They weren't the weapons of mass destruction he had officially charged them with, but in a sealed space station. These everyday supplies could easily put his entire squad in body bags. His strict adherence to the interstellar Geneva Conventions caught in his throat. A tactical shield at 70% wasn't going to stop invisible toxic gas, and it sure as hell wasn't going to stop a hydraulic wrench from caving his skull in. Slowly, Zaral's finger slipped off the trigger. Shaking, he lowered his rifle, resting it on the superheated metal deck. David pushed his way past the maintenance workers blocking him. He threw the filthy rag back over his shoulder, hefted his mop, and shook his empty ammonia bottle at the captain. Frowning, he cut straight to the point, saved the speech. "Are you security boys reimbursing me for my $8 cleaner, the 3 cracked tiles, and my overtime pay tonight, or what?"
Hello everyone, Author here. Honestly, writing this story was an absolute blast. The inspiration for this piece came from a desire to flip the traditional HFY humanity, fuck yeah, trope completely on its head. In most space operas, when we talk about humanity's triumph, it usually involves invincible dreadnoughts, mech suits, or genetically enhanced super soldiers. But I wanted to highlight a different, much more grounded human superpower. That gritty blue-collar resilience that allows us to grumble through the most absurdly terrifying situations, grab whatever tool is handy, and just get the damn job done. David is the ultimate embodiment of every working-class hero who's been screwed over by management or the Interstellar Hub Committee, but refuses to bend. Taking down a 3-ton alien apex predator with a heavy-duty mop and $8 worth of discount supermarket chemicals sounds like pure, chaotic, dark humor. But if you think about it, humanity is already a hardcore species that casually handles hazardous chemicals, heavy machinery, and extreme environments on a daily basis. In this universe, high-tier alien civilizations might have plasma rifles, tactical energy shields, and a metric ton of arrogance. But they have absolutely no idea how terrifying the wrath of an underpaid janitor who just had his freshly mopped floor ruined and his overtime pay denied can truly be. To David, missing his cold beer and the evening sports broadcast is a far greater threat than any cosmic horror. I hope you enjoyed this anti-cliché sci-fi comedy, heavily scented with diesel fuel, bleach, and bad attitude. Here is a toast to all the unrelenting blue-collar workers across the universe.